Hey, I'm Zach McDonald, your real estate agent with Real Property Associates, and today I'm going to share 5 tips on selling your home with a tenant in place. Okay, let's be completely honest. When you're selling your home, it's a lot easier to sell your house when it's vacant or owner-occupied versus having a tenant in place. But some people, if you're an investor or maybe you had your house, you moved out and been kind of renting it out for the last few years, and you wouldn't necessarily consider yourself an investor, but you do have this rental property, what's the process for getting your house sold? And I would say it's a little bit different than selling your house when you're occupying it or it's vacant. So I'm going to share with you a few tips that I think will help set you up for success when trying to sell your house with a tenant occupying the property. Tip number 1 for selling your house with a tenant in place is do a walkthrough. This could be you as the owner, or if you have a property manager, have your property manager walk through the property and assess the situation. I treat it personally a lot like a move out inspection. What's the situation? Is there any damage to the property? Are there any improvements that could be made? What needs to be cleaned up? What condition is the property in? I think the big idea is, first of all, you don't want to have any surprises. I recently helped a client purchase a 4-plex, and this 4-plex was occupied, and the seller had the tenants essentially share what condition the property was in. And all of the tenants said, oh, it's great, my unit looks awesome, blah, blah, blah. So they marketed one vacant unit and said all of them look very similar and have the same quality of finishes, and they're all in good repair. Well, my client purchased the property. There was a bidding war because everybody was excited about this 4-plex in perfect condition. And we got to do an inspection, which is good. And we paid significantly over the asking price to tie up this property. And then after the inspection, ended up getting almost $50,000 off the price. So I think as a seller, you don't want to be in that situation where the buyer's coming to you and has proof that your property is not in the condition that you thought it was in. And ideally, maybe you could have taken care of some of those things ahead of time. Now, a lot of owners and property managers might have better tabs on what's going on with the property, and maybe they do frequent check-ins. I know a lot of management companies will at least go through and check once a year or something like that, right? To make sure that the property is being kept up and that the owner is taking good care of the property. But if you're not checking on your property regularly and then you're going to sell it, you don't want to have the surprises, but you also want to have the ability to maybe correct some things. If there are some minor projects, maybe your handyman can do them versus paying somebody a higher rate to do it on the fly. And you typically pay more to have a qualified professional take care of something that maybe a handyman could take care of. Tip number 2 for selling your house with a tenant in place is get your tenant's buy-in. Now, when you're selling your property with a tenant in place, it's really helpful if the tenant is helpful in the process. If they know that it's happening, first of all, they're able to prepare themselves for the switch in ownership and potentially maybe getting kicked out if they're on a month-to-month lease, but at least they know and there's transparency. I think a lot of owners are afraid that if they tell their tenants what's going on, that their tenant might freak out and damage the property or something like that. And I guess you have to assess the situation with your own tenants. But I find that most of the time it makes sense to be transparent with the tenant about the situation. I think it allows greater freedom throughout the process. Instead of trying to walk on eggshells and maybe not putting a sign in the ground out front and not having photos and not telling anybody it's happening and only allowing showings after the property's sold, if you get your tenants buy-in, they might allow showings on less than 24 hours notice. Maybe they can accommodate 1 or 2 hours notice so that agents can show their clients. And at the same time, maybe the tenant will keep the property clean and neat while you're there. Maybe they'll help with some of the maintenance on the property, or at least keep their own unit looking nice. So I've found that clients can sometimes incentivize the tenant. Maybe it's a refund of their security deposit, or maybe it's a refund of last month's rent or something like that. That's a small amount of money to have a tenant that's cooperative and helpful in the sale of the property versus not. Tip number 3 for selling your home with a tenant in place is make sure that you have your records and bookkeeping in order. When you're selling your property, people are going to want to know the situation, specifically if you're selling it to another investor and you still have the tenant in place. So a typical investor wants to know what the leases look like. Are they month to month? How much time is left on the leases? They want to know what the rent is. How much are you bringing in? Are the tenants actually paying their rent on time? And they're also going to want to know, what are the expenses, right? How much are you bringing in? How much is going out? Who's responsible for paying what? They want to know what maintenance has been done to the property recently. They want to know what maintenance is coming up. So all the information that you can provide to the future owner is going to be helpful. Transparency is always the best. Hiding things doesn't help anyone in the process. So if you can have everything organized and together, it helps with the presentation and marketing of the property. Tip number 4 for selling your house with a tenant in place is discussing a buyout with the tenant. Now, if you have a tenant in place and they are maybe open to moving out, you potentially increase the value of your property. A lot of people, when they look at a rental, it depends on the situation, but let's say you have a single family home that you're renting out. When you are marketing a single family home or even a condo with a tenant in place, you are essentially locking in the new buyer to honor the lease. So that new buyer is either having to honor a lease that's below market value maybe, or you limit severely the amount of people that might be interested in your property. On the flip side, if you're selling a single family home and there are no tenants in place and it's vacant, it's a lot easier to attract more buyers. There are a lot more people that could buy that house and move into it and occupy it themselves. So you cut out all of the owner-occupied buyers when there's a tenant in place. So in a situation with a condo or a single family home, it might make sense to negotiate a buyout with the current tenant. And it could look like a lot of different things. Sometimes it's as simple as 1 month's rent or 2 months' rent. It really depends on the situation. Maybe the tenant was already planning to move out anyway or was hoping to be able to move out, and they might be able to either get out and not have to pay anything, or maybe you can give them a little bit of an incentive to make that move earlier rather than later. So there's lots of things that can be discussed in this conversation as the landlord and the owner with the tenant. Now, in other situations, if you have a fourplex or a duplex or a triplex or maybe even a bigger building, maybe it's an apartment complex, it's a little different situation. If you're charging below market rents, it might be better to have some of those people out, right? Maybe it's half occupied, but there's opportunity to start doing some projects to increase the value of the property and grow the rents. Other times, maybe it makes sense to have it completely occupied if you are getting market rents. Owners want to know all this information when they're coming into it, and if you have a bigger project, maybe it's a bigger amount of doors, a larger number of doors, then you're going to want to have tenants in place more often than not. But in the single family or condo situation, it's usually better when you don't have a tenant in place. Step number 5 for selling your house with a tenant in place is get professional photography and videography. A lot of times, you're able to get access to the property and still get professional photography and videography, which is what's going to give your house or your property the best exposure online. And that's going to help you attract the most amount of buyers and the most amount of offers. If you find yourself reluctant to, as we talked about earlier in the video, talk with the tenant and do a walkthrough and also get their buy-in, I think you miss out on a lot of potential opportunities to attract the next owner of the property. So if you can have that conversation up front with the tenant, maybe they'll help you clean it up. It looks nice, you get photos, you get video, and so people can actually see what the property looks like on the inside. There are plenty of properties that sell without any kind of interior photos, specifically rental properties, and we're talking about maybe a duplex, triplex that's rented out. But in those situations, buyers don't know what they're getting. They can't see the inside of the property, And the chance that the buyer is going to walk away from the deal goes up significantly, and you might have to go through this process multiple times. But if you can show them what it looks like on the inside accurately, you can be attracting the right buyers and potentially soliciting more offers and a better price. I hope you found these 5 tips on selling your property with a tenant in place helpful, and this list is by no means exhaustive, but it's some of the things that I talk with people who need to sell a property with a tenant in place. If you found this video valuable, please give it a thumbs up, and I'd love some feedback in the comments below if you have some other ideas that might be helpful for selling a property with a tenant in place. And of course, if you want to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing to my channel.